We touched on this story last night, didn't we? The Bibby Stockholm. Well, I have to say that today, hardly anyone, we think, is on board this vessel. Of course, you'll be familiar with the fact that 500 people apparently will be housed here eventually. I use the word eventually because if that happens, I don't know, I will probably... Well, I was going to say I'll eat my hat, but I don't wear hats, so that's not going to happen, is it? But anyway, we think that there's about 15 or so people on there. Why? Of course, because lawyers, etc., have gotten involved and put a stop to it. And now the Home Office has sent a letter to asylum seekers basically saying that if you don't accept accommodation, you could have your support, government support, removed because accommodation is provided on a no-choice basis. Daniel Moylan, I want to pick up with you on this first concept about actually, as a migrant, is it and should it be a case of you get what you're given and if you don't want it, tough?
Yeah, I don't know any refugee camps in any other parts of the world where people are allowed to say, I'd rather not be here, I'd rather be in an hotel or have a house of my own or whatever. Most refugee camps are pretty desperate and desolate places to be. But people would rather be there because they're safe and they've fled a genuine fear, they're from a genuine fear, and that's why they're there. The assumption is if you're an asylum seeker, coming to this country, that you're fleeing from a genuine fear. That's what you want to prove. That's what you want to establish. And I think you would be grateful to have any accommodation that was provided for you. You're not in prison if you go on one of these barges. You can leave, you can come and go, and so on. But that's the accommodation that will be provided.
But they're not getting on it, and this is because of support from charities such as Care for Calais and lawyers and stuff like that. And what they're saying is that actually it's inhumane to put these people on what they're calling basically like almost a prison-like conditions, which I personally think is ridiculous. So they're not getting on. So actually, do you think that if they sit there and say, no, I'm not going to happen, it's not going to happen, do you honestly believe that the government support would cease?
I don't know about that.
I don't think it would.
I think government support might cease, but I think the danger, of course, is you end up with people living on the streets and so on, which we wouldn't want to have either, and would be more, in some ways, more terrifying. I think the fact that they might have black marks against their asylum claim, or it might not be processed because they would be demonstrating they weren't really here, perhaps because they were fleeing a real fear of persecution, that might be a factor that might come into play. I think it probably will be filled up, however, the barge, over time. I don't know what eventually means, Michelle. I'm not saying it's going to happen next week or the week after, but I think it probably will be filled up over time. And I don't see that it's objectionable accommodation for what is meant to be a temporary period. These sorts of barges, and this one in particular, has been used in the past by workers and so on oil rigs and things like that.
It has indeed. Let me just bring Jo in there. Jo, what's your thoughts?
Well, I think, you know, one of the things that we all know and we've discussed often on this programme is the huge backlog of asylum cases that have not been processed. Even if the barge was filled up tomorrow, I think it's got a capacity for 500 people, that is still only 1% of the people who are coming here anyway. So it's not going to make a huge dent. Meanwhile, you've got people, sometimes families, whole families, who have been stuck. I'm sure they don't want to be stuck in not particularly nice hotels on the side of motorways, waiting for over 18 months for their claims to be processed. And the government really is doing this scattergun thing of, right, we're going to do this, oh no, we're going to put the waves back, no, we're going to send them to Ascension Island. All of these things cost money, but they're not dealing with the fundamental problem, which is get through the backlog, work out who is genuine and who isn't, get on with deporting those who are not genuine, and get on sorting out the ones that are genuine, who may well be people who can contribute very meaningfully to the economy and our local communities. Because it's, you know, it's just so inflammatory. And I think...
What's inflammatory?
Well, I think the problem, and I think Daniel is very measured in his argument or his answer to you, that actually, even if the government said take it or leave it, they cannot make somebody destitute. You know, it was against international law. And as he says, you would then end up with people where?
But so hold on. So, I mean, I've got the letter here. It says you were previously granted support under a Section 95 of the Immigration and Asylum Act 1999. It goes on. It says basically, this is your notification that you're being provided with an alternate accommodation. Accommodation is offered on a no-choice basis. Where asylum seekers fail to take up an offer of a suitable accommodation without reasonable explanation, there should be no expectation that alternate accommodation will be offered. But here is the thing, and we've been hearing about that in the news bulletin as well. There are so many organisations and lawyers now that have become so slick at what I would say gaming the system, exploiting the system. And what I found interesting there is that sentence, which is about if you turn this down without a reasonable explanation. And there, for me, is a massive glaring loophole because when you look, for example, one of the chief execs that's fighting this, one of the charities that are fighting this, is saying, and I think this is ridiculous, I think this is quite inflammatory, really. It's saying these individuals are effectively kept away from sunlight and daylight other than what comes through pretty limited windows. So, in effect, it's close to being a detention facility for many who already would have been in detention facilities. I find that quite inflammatory because, no, you're not going to be kept away from sunlight and daylight because all you've got is a window. Well, welcome to the real world. Most people in their house, they have windows. That is how we live, in a box with windows. These people can go outside. They've got outside courtyards. They've got these shuttle bus services. If you can't be bothered to get on your bus or you miss your bus, you get free taxis back. So I find that quite inflammatory.
No, I think that's part of the problem, Michelle, that the whole argument has become so inflamed. I mean, if you make a law or you make a statement that any lawyer can drive a coach and horses through, then you yourself, in other words, the Home Office... In fact, there was a very interesting discussion on Patrick's programme just before we came on air with a couple of barristers. You know, if a law is not properly made, if the Home Office is not dealing with things and creating a robust enough case, then they've only got themselves to blame. And there is no doubt that there are probably some dodgy people out there who are trying to, as you say, game the system and make money out of people who've already spent thousands on getting here in illegal boats. But there is also the point that, you know, when you have, and I suspect this is where we're going next, when you have the deputy chairman of the Conservative Party,
the Anderson,
an MP, saying not overheard to somebody in a private conversation, but speaking to a national newspaper, using language that if any of us used at this time
So he
of night...
basically said, in case you're not familiar at home, he basically said if these people don't like the barges, they can F off back to France. That's what he said.
Yeah.
But loads of people, I'm telling you now, they'll be sitting at home high-fiving that going, yes.
Of course they will.
Yes.
Of course they will. That's absolutely their business. I think it's a real shame that the Conservative Party, which is I am not a member of and I'm not a supporter of, but it has a huge and fine history, for somebody to use that sort of language...
Is that wrong?
Well, I don't myself approve of using foul language.
But is it wrong?
Indeed, I block people on Twitter who use foul language because I'm sick to death of it now, and there's far too much of it. So I
but is it wrong for the deputy chairman of the Tory party to say that language in a media interview?
Yeah, I wouldn't approve. I wouldn't use that. And
no, I'm not asking you. I'm not saying would you use it because you told me you wouldn't use it. I'm saying, do you think it's wrong that the deputy chairman of the Tory party used that language in a media interview?
I don't think he should have said it like that. But I think you have to recognise an awful lot of people do use language like that when they want to express themselves emphatically. It's become very common. And they will recognise exactly what he was saying. And I think the sentiment is one that a lot of people do understand. The whole idea is you've come here, you are meant to be fleeing persecution. That's the whole basis of an asylum claim.
But the sentiment is
that you
lost.
have a justified fear of persecution where you are. Now, you've actually come from France. That's what you've done. And it's but you've got this fear of persecution, and you're quibbling about whether you stay in this accommodation or that accommodation. But whereas, if you come in many countries, you'd be living in a tent.
True.
I just think it would have been helpful if the Prime Minister's or Number 10 spokesman or the Justice Secretary, Alex Chalk, had the decency to say, that's not the language that we would have used, because I think there will be a lot of people out there who perhaps might be, that whilst one's at high-fiving, it becomes very difficult then, doesn't it, for teachers, for people in shops...
Come on. When you say the language, not on this topic, that's come out of senior Labour Party peers, people talking about scum and all sorts about Tory scum and stuff like that. Please do not lecture us about poor language and its effect on children and schools.
Angela Rayner made that comment, the deputy leader of the Labour Party.
She's not the only one.
She may not be the only one, but that's the one that most people will know about. But that was not in a media interview. The point about Lee Anderson is that he said it knowing full well...
She knew full well what she was saying.
Well, she may well have done, but it was a private thing. I mean, you know, and somewhere in the bottom of this, we seem to have forgotten that the people that we're talking about are actually human beings. They're not there as cannon fodder between left and right. No.
Well, Alan says, thank goodness for a straight-talking politician. Lee Anderson simply reflects what a sizable majority of the country thinks. Yes, Alan, he does. But the question is it appropriate language for such a senior politician to actually use? Is that appropriate? Have you got children, grandkids, for example? If you heard them swear, do you pull them up these days? Is swearing still the kind of thing that it used to be? I think that's an interesting question, because these days so many people do swear like troopers, don't they? Do you think it's still the right thing to do, the wrong thing to do? Is it appropriate for the Deputy Chairman of the Tories to use that language? Yes, we connect with it. Yes, we resonate with it. Yes, many people might agree. But in that position, in that context, to the media, appropriate or not? You tell me. GBviews@gbnews.com is how you get a hold of me.